According to sources close to international analytical circles, in Moscow and Beijing, what is happening around Greenland is being perceived with barely concealed satisfaction, as the current escalation has become a rare example of the United States itself undermining the system of alliances it created. Russian assessments emphasize that Donald Trump's policy is effectively accelerating processes that Moscow and Beijing have been pursuing for years, namely, the destruction of Western Bloc unity from within without direct external pressure. For Russia, the key issue is not Greenland itself, but the consequences of a possible force-based scenario. If the US decides on military action against the territory of an ally, this would mean the de facto end of NATO as an effective alliance. In Russian analytical reports, such an outcome is described as the most favorable, because it would finally strip the West of the moral and political superiority on which its global role was built. Publicly, Moscow demonstratively distances itself from the conflict, calling for dialogue and emphasizing the need to respect international law. But behind closed doors, according to insiders, the tone of assessments is entirely different. In recent days, leaks have been actively discussed in expert circles, according to which Vladimir Putin has instructed the diplomatic corps and intelligence structures to closely monitor developments and act in a way that does not hinder Washington's course, understanding that each new escalation only accelerates the collapse of Western unity. For Moscow and Beijing, such a scenario is seen as fateful, as it creates a new reality in which former alliances lose significance and force-based decisions no longer require the previous justifications. Closed assessments state that if the West itself legitimizes the revision of borders by force, this effectively sanctions all future operations that Russia and China view as the restoration of control over territories they consider their own. That is why what is happening around Greenland is perceived not as a regional crisis, but as a trigger point for a new world order. At the same time, Russia is also showing heightened interest in the Arctic, and in Greenland in particular, viewing the current instability as a chance to strengthen its positions in the region, expand its influence, and legitimize further buildup of presence under the pretext of protecting national interests. Analysts emphasize that Moscow is acting with extreme caution, avoiding sharp moves so as not to prematurely rally the West, but is carefully preparing for a world in which the old rules no longer apply. In this logic, Greenland becomes not a goal, but a symbol of the end of old alliances and the beginning of an era in which each center of power acts solely on the basis of its own interests, and the fragmentation of the Western Bloc opens a window of opportunity for those ready to seize the moment. Against this backdrop, Russian strategic circles increasingly voice the view that the world has reached a rare moment when geopolitical opponents are making mistakes that cannot be compensated even by decades of subsequent diplomacy. According to sources close to pro-government analytical centers, in Moscow, what is happening around Greenland is seen as the culmination of a long process in which the United States itself, step by step, undermined trust in its own leadership, and has now brought this process to a point where there may be no way back. Closed reports emphasize that if Donald Trump decides on a force-based scenario, this would represent not merely a violation of one of NATO's taboos, but the destruction of the very logic of allied commitments that for decades kept the West in a state of relative unity. For Russia, this means not a tactical gain, but a strategic turning point. The main factor restraining the redistribution of influence in Europe and the Arctic is disappearing: the collective will of the Western Bloc. That is why, according to insiders, Moscow is not seeking to accelerate events or provoke escalation, understanding that every new sharp reaction from Russia could play into the hands of those forces in the West that are still trying to preserve unity. The strategy is extremely simple: to allow the process to develop naturally, recording the changes and preparing for their consequences. In this context, leaks about informal instructions to Russian diplomats and intelligence services are interpreted not as an attempt at direct interference, but as a directive to maximize use of the opening window of opportunity, in which any weakening of Western consensus automatically works in Moscow's favor. Russian sources emphasize that this is not about supporting a specific politician, but about supporting the trend itself, the trend toward the destruction of former alliances and norms. In parallel, Moscow is closely synchronizing its assessments with Beijing, which, according to insiders, shares the Russian view of what is happening. For China, the Greenland crisis is confirmation that the West has lost its moral right to lecture others about rules and sovereignty, and therefore any future use of force in Asia will be perceived in a completely different international environment. In Russian analytical circles, it is emphasized that the convergence of Moscow's and Beijing's interests on this issue is historical in nature. Both countries see in what is happening a chance to legitimize the transition of the world to a new model in which the right of force no longer disguises itself as universal values. That is why the events around Greenland are called fateful, not because they determine the fate of a single island, but because they change the boundaries of what is permissible. At the same time, Russia, unlike the United States, seeks to demonstrate ostentatious restraint, understanding that premature triumph could provoke Western consolidation. Moscow's public statements are kept in a neutral tone, emphasizing dialogue and international law. Yet behind closed doors, according to insiders, active preparation is underway for a world after NATO. In these scenarios, Greenland occupies a special place not as an object of immediate claims, but as a strategic node of the Arctic, around which a new configuration of forces will be built. Russia has long viewed the Arctic as a key region of the 21st century, where resources, logistics, and military presence converge, and the current instability only enhances its opportunities to strengthen its positions. Russian reports emphasize that the weakening of NATO automatically expands room for maneuver, from strengthening the Northern Sea route to expanding diplomatic and economic presence in Arctic structures. In this sense, Russia's interest in Greenland is not aggressive, but structural. Moscow sees a chance to entrench itself in a region where the former balance of power is beginning to crumble. Analysts note that for the Kremlin, it is especially important that the current crisis does not require active actions from Russia. Patience and precise calculation are sufficient. If the United States continues on a path of confrontation with its allies, the West will itself lose its main advantage, the ability to act collectively. And then, as sources emphasize, the world will indeed enter a new era in which former blocs collapse, and the international system will be built around situational alliances and regional centers of power. For Russia, this means a return to a model in which it feels most confident, a multipolar world without a dominant hegemon. That is why, in Moscow, what is happening around Greenland is seen not as a crisis, but as the beginning of a process for which the country has been preparing for years. And the further the escalation goes, the clearer it becomes that the fate of NATO and the Western world is being decided not in future negotiations, but in current decisions, each of which irreversibly shifts the balance. In this new context, Greenland becomes a symbol of the end of the old era, and Russia and China emerge as the main beneficiaries of a world where rules are no longer dictated by a single center, but are formed through a struggle of interests, with victory going to those who know how to wait and exploit the mistakes of others.